Hello Unwrappers, Ollie here. Just before we get going with today's show, an apology for the sound quality on Holden's line. We sent him a decent microphone and he managed to select the wrong input when doing his at-home recording. But he's the boss, so you'll hear nothing disparaging about that from me. And now, on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday the 27th of November, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the worst migrant tragedy in the Channel since records began, with 27 deaths. In one day, US teenager Kyle Rittenhouse, who shot and killed 2 men during the racial injustice protests, being cleared of homicide, and the Prime Minister stumbling through his speech at the CBI by talking about his trip to Peppa Pig World. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, we have Joe Evans and the boss man, Holden Frith, and we're joined by the author and science and technology correspondent for The Economist, Alok. Joe, you're up first, which means, of course, I shall now produce the prop globe from under my desk and give it a good spin to reveal which foreign country we'll end up on today. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
How a dead elk plays into a new era of Russian repression.
The Kremlin is very versatile in using different tactics to crush not just political opposition, but to deal with any sources of discontent or political dissidence. They have used COVID very imaginatively. Instead of actually saving Russian lives, they've used it as a repressive measure.
Russian and Eastern European editor Arkady Ostrovsky reporting for The Economist earlier this month about the crushing of opposition in Putin's Russia and how the scene was then. Joe, what's been happening this week?
Yes, so this week we have seen one of these examples of the slightly creative measures used by the Kremlin to crush dissent in Russia. Putin has been accused of trying to stitch up a political rival, essentially, who has been arrested and charged over the death of an elk. Valery Rashkin is the leader of the Moscow branch of Russia's Communist Party, and he's facing criminal charges of illegal hunting and also the threat of losing his parliamentary seat after he was discovered cutting up an elk carcass at night in a forest.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpick here, but before we get to the elk, just with regards to Rashkin then, so he's the leader of the Moscow Communist Party. For people who don't follow Russian politics that closely, they might think, Communist Party, isn't that a friend of Putin's?
So the Communist Party is one of the few parties that is allowed essentially to operate within Russia's very tightly controlled political sphere. The trouble is that Rashkin has been at odds with the Kremlin for months after he was one of the people who very vocally challenged the results of September's parliamentary elections. And he's also been very vocal in arguing against the Kremlin's online voting project, which is something of a pet project for Putin. It's essentially a system that critics have said will make it far easier for them to rig elections. The State Duma elections that he took issue with were rigged by all accounts. There was multiple episodes of ballot stuffing and forced voting, as well as irregularities recorded. So fellow communist lawmakers have essentially argued that this position the Kremlin is taking in terms of Rashkin's illegal hunting is essentially just a method of intimidating those who are brave enough to oppose Putin.
Okay, and the facts are a little bit muddy, aren't they? But as far as we know, Joe, what happened regarding the elk?
Yes, they are somewhat muddy, and Rashkin has sort of muddied the water himself. At first, he was caught with the elk in the middle of the night. He was asked to get out of his car, and all of this was filmed. At first, he said that he had simply found the elk and that he was going to alert somebody to the fact that it had been shot, which was somewhat unbelievable given that authorities also found 2 quite large hunting knives in his car. He was also sort of slightly staggering and refused to be breathalyzed at the scene. He then changed his mind a few days later and said that actually what had happened is he had shot the elk, but he'd thought that it was a boar. He's completely accepted responsibility. He said this is what happened and has actually offered to either pay a fine or release an elk into the wild in order to replace the one that he inadvertently shot.
I mean, Holden, it's quite difficult, isn't it, as much as anything, just to keep track on Russian hunting laws, because you can hunt there and you can hunt certain types of moose, but not this elk. I mean, what's he actually accused of doing? What's the illegal bit?
He shouldn't have shot this elk at this time, it seems. I have read the suggestion that apart from the sort of general desire amongst Putin's party, United Russia, to discredit and jail any leaders of the opposition that it can. There might actually be a more specific motive with this particular arrest, because several of Putin's own MPs have been accused of what the Russian academic Konstantin Gars called ugly and crazy hunting episodes. He said the government is now jumping on Rashkin to show it's not only United Russia MPs who do evil and cruel things to animals.
Yes, because there's been a very grisly episode, hasn't there, Holden, of a particular hunting episode within Putin's own party?
Yes, there was a member of United Russia who was accused of killing and storing the bodies of more than 100 birds, and that got a lot of attention in Russia. And so one theory is that this is an attempt to sort of, tar everybody with the same animal cruelty brush.
Yeah, I mean, Alok, your own paper, The Economist, is one of the outlets that has been covering this story very much in the context of, the hunting is a side issue. This is really about Putin's suppression of the opposition. Do you see it that way as well?
It's hard not to see it that way, isn't it? I mean, the clip you played from Arkady, our Russian editor, earlier just outlines just the direction in which Russia is travelling, and it's a disturbing one. I mean, for a long time, Putin has been in power now for more than 2 decades in some form or another. Prime minister for a brief spell, but basically president before then. And I think the thinking was in the first few years of that, the decade of that he was a bureaucrat who would probably steer Russia into a more open and maybe not democratic, but definitely more open sort of world. And that was happening. And then about 10 years ago, he decided that he wanted to stay in power rather than doing what good leaders do in these sorts of countries, which is peacefully transfer to another generation. And he decided to create more support and a power base. And I think that you can see the impact of it. It's becoming more and more autocratic. And when you have that much power, what you fear most is losing the power. And so therefore you want to keep it going. Putin, interestingly, you said at the beginning, Olly, about how Rashkin is a communist party. Why would he be being targeted? Well, actually, Putin himself, although he came from the Communist Party, he's not a Communist Party member anymore. He's an independent. He doesn't have a party. He's endorsed by many, many other parties, which probably are in his pocket, but he's independent. It's a really strange setup he's got, and there's no end in sight to him being at the top of Russian politics. And this is how he stays there, by squashing opposition in all ways.
And I guess sort of intimidating them, Joe. I mean, for Rashkin to be stopped with this elk in the back of his car in the middle of the countryside in the middle of the night would have required police to be following him. So the suggestion is he was framed, basically. It's a nudge, isn't it? We're watching you.
Well, quite, and this is how quite a lot of Putin's repression takes place. The most obvious example I'd imagine to our readers in the UK would be Alexei Navalny, who was obviously poisoned in 2020. Again, the assumption is if you were poisoned in a hotel, as he was, you are being followed. Sergei Zuev, who is the head of Moscow's Higher School of Social and Economic Science, which is one of the most well-regarded liberal universities in Russia, was arrested on fraud charges in October. Again, the suggestion is that these things are somewhat trumped up, and at the time he was recovering from heart treatment and was taken from house arrest to a prison cell, where the assumption is that there was an effort to extract a false confession from him. A string of non-governmental organisations, including newspapers and also charities, have been labelled foreign agents under the foreign agent legislation that was passed in Russia, which is essentially a classification that allows the Kremlin to target anybody who receives money from abroad and voices a political opinion. So this is sort of part of a wider range of repressive measures that have been taken, which, as Alok says, do suggest that Putin has very much shifted from his sort of early autocratic rule of Russia into a far more what we would understand to be dictatorial rule of Russia.
And just a further point on Valery Rushkin, he's the head of the Communist Party, and the Communist Party is... this might sound strange, it's probably the most popular bit of opposition that Putin has. So in the coming elections, it's the Communist Party that have been taken up as the standard bearers for the opposition to Putin by the young, for example. They're the ones that support them, and it's not necessarily that the younger folk in Russia believe in communism, but it's the only structure they can support that's in opposition. And so you could see the arrest of Rushkin as a way of decapitating that power.
Yeah, I mean, literally the only ones they can support, Holden, because Navalny's organisation has been effectively dismantled.
Yeah, there's been sort of the high-profile part of the Russian repression system is the poisonings, the assassinations, the foreign operations. But alongside that, there's also a much more insidious attempt to really criminalize anyone who's within those parties, anyone who's taking part in protests. The security forces have become increasingly violent in their dispersal of protesters as protesters have become more political in their demands. So this does seem to be a step towards a much more integrated system of repression that sort of is part of a network of security forces, police, the legal systems, the courts. There's increasingly few areas where opponents to Putin can actually carry out their activities.
And as ever, Joe, it's quite a clever piece of intimidation in a way, isn't it? Because from the point of view of Britain and America and the EU, responding to this is tricky because, as you said, it looks like this guy probably was drunk driving and he probably was hunting illegally. And so, it's difficult to say, well, they shouldn't be cracking down on that, even though everyone can see the political direction this is coming from.
Perhaps, but to speak to your point earlier, Ollie, about it being a sort of very effective use of intimidation tactics, a third of Russia's government budget is spent on security and defence by best estimates. Much of that is directed inwards towards its own people. And as incomes and the economy of Russia has struggled over the past decade, Russia's police and security services have become bigger and more extensive. So it would suggest that none of this essentially is reversible. It doesn't suggest that Putin has any intention of reverting back to the early years of his rule, the first decade that Alok spoke about earlier, in which his popularity was genuinely buoyed by widespread prosperity in Russia, that the economy grew very rapidly, people's quality of lives improved very rapidly. To speak to your point about whether the West will find it difficult to confront these sort of types of intimidation, we have to remember who we're dealing with here. Putin is a leader who meddles in Western elections. He's peddled anti-vaccination propaganda for the last 2 years. He fights proxy battles with America in both Africa and the Middle East. His regime has attempted to murder dissidents abroad, has successfully murdered dissidents abroad. And just if you look over the last 2 or 3 months, they've used the promise of energy supplies, specifically gas, in an attempt to undermine the European Union's relationship with countries like Ukraine and Moldova. I think when you sort of consider it to that backdrop, it becomes very difficult actually for the West to ignore these things.
Well, and yet we are ignoring it, Alok, in a way, aren't we? I mean, if the war in Syria didn't bring it to a head, this isn't going to.
I don't know how to answer that question about whether we're ignoring it. I feel like people know, and they know that it's a threat, and it's becoming an increasing threat. As Joe says, Putin is kind of on the world stage as being a kind of wily and kind of very disturbing character in international sort of order. I mean, there's only one way it can go. Putin doesn't want to lose power, so he's going to increase the autocracy and crush opposition. I mean, another example of this is the one real piece of opposition that he has now is the internet, right? He can't control the internet to the extent that, for example, China does. So people are seeing things all over the place. People watch YouTube. I mean, Navalny's documentary about Putin's palaces obviously angered a lot of people, and that's how Navalny and his teams operate. But there's now an attempt to replace YouTube in Russia with something called RuTube. I don't know if you've seen this. It's basically, Russian content, kind of for Russian people. And, whether that'll take off or not, who knows? But you can see that there's already a media transformation campaign going on to sort of try and suggest that, the world out there is not telling you the truth and this is where you get the truth from. Putin invented a way of communicating that then the populist leaders around the world copied, which is basically not to deny things that are clearly wrong, but just to put out lots more rubbish out there and say all of this is wrong. Look at all this stuff and confuse people. He's a master at that, and I think that you're going to see a lot more of that.
Joe, a final thought?
Yeah, the only good news really, I think, from the West here is that despite what Alok has just said about Putin pumping out as much rubbish as possible to confuse people, the figures seem to suggest that this stuff isn't working. Just as most Soviet people didn't believe that communism had any advantage over capitalism, Russians don't seem to believe that Putin has any advantage over any other type of leadership. Polling by the Levada Centre, which ironically came out of sort of Glasnost and Gorbachev's opening up and has been labelled a foreign agent now by Putin, has found that almost 80% of Russians say that the country should see the West as a partner and friend. So there is an opportunity there if Western countries do choose to take this stuff on to try and drive a wedge between the Kremlin and between this quite large number of people who do genuinely see the East and Western confrontation that Putin has tried to build up as completely incompatible with the future of Russia's prosperity.
Okay, we will continue spewing out as much rubbish as possible, but to inform, not to confuse. After this, it's Holden's turn. Okay, Holden, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
It's the latest from the glamorous world of bootleg refrigerant gases.
What have you got for me?
21,404 and
404134.
Yeah.
Can you get more in?
Yeah.
3, 4. So how are they made here, or do you get them in from
Europe. They get it from Europe. It's really hard now because of the customs and problem.
What's the problem with the customs?
They're not allowed to bring it inside.
Well, look, thanks very much.
Some secret filming broadcast by the BBC on Wednesday. Holden, undercover filming, a grubby exchange on a doorstep, but this isn't drugs or weapons, is it? It's rather less glamorous contraband.
Very, very unglamorous indeed. This was an undercover sting carried out by Angus Crawford and Tony Smith of the BBC, in which they posed as customers desperate to buy hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs, which are the gases that replaced CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, when they were banned in 1987 because of the damage they were doing to the ozone layer.
Okay, this is normally a time where I'd say, oh, it's a shame we haven't got Alok here, but we have got Alok here. So, Alok, just briefly before I return to Holden on the story, what are HFCs exactly?
Well, so as Holden said, they were introduced after the Montreal Protocol back in the late 1980s, when we discovered there was a hole in the ozone layer caused by these gases from various refrigerants and air conditioners and things floating up there and destroying the ozone layer. People thought, well, we must do something about them, and HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, were there already. We had them already, and they could be used as refrigerants and replace CFCs, so they don't destroy the ozone layer.
So they were designed as a green alternative to ozone-destroying chemicals.
Well, so the second half of what I was going to say was that actually they're not green at all, which is that, they don't destroy the ozone layer, but they're incredibly powerful greenhouse gas. So much, much more powerful than carbon dioxide. And if you leave a little bit of them in the atmosphere, it warms up the atmosphere very, very greatly, basically. So they're not good. They're not good.
And hence have also been banned, Holden, which is the issue here. People still have technology at home, I guess, that needs this stuff, but you can't buy it anymore.
Yeah, they haven't quite been banned yet. They're heavily regulated. They're being phased out in the UK and in the EU too. But there is still machinery that uses these HFCs, particularly fridges and air conditioning units. And the older the machinery, the more likely it is to use the most harmful HFCs, which can be thousands of times more warming than carbon dioxide.
Okay, so would you have any reason to want to go and get this stuff illegally apart from price? Is it just cost driven? It's just that you've got an old bit of kit that you want to keep running as long as possible and you don't want to pay top dollar because it's now really expensive?
Yeah, that's essentially it. Because they're regulated here, only companies with a license to sell these particular gases can do so, and they can only sell a limited quota. And so that means the cost is very high, whereas in China, where they're less heavily regulated, it's much cheaper. So a canister of HFCs that can be made and sold in China for £30 will sell for more than £200 here, and that's created this illicit market for smuggled canisters of HFC.
Okay, but as a consumer, I mean, I don't know what gas is in my fridge, but I don't know because I don't replace it. If ever I was going to do something like that, I'd be on the phone to Samsung and they'd send an engineer round. So, I mean, who's buying this stuff? Only like electricians and stuff, right? I mean, how big an issue is it?
You don't want to be replacing the gases in your fridge.
Exactly.
You don't want to do that. They're not. That's not healthy, and it's not a good idea. If the gases in your fridge are leaking, then you need a new fridge. That's unfortunately the way to do that. Yeah, no, you don't need doing that. And I think that obviously what's happened is that, if you're an industry or, you've got a company that happens to have a very old fridge, these are expensive items. They might cost tens of thousands of pounds. And so you want to get a few more years use out of them, and they use up a lot of this stuff. So I suppose, I mean, I don't know, I'm not in the heads of those sorts of people, but I guess that's why you would try and get this stuff. And it is heavily regulated, so it's expensive, and there's probably very careful environmental rules around how you dispose of it, which also costs money. So, I mean, the idea of getting rid of them, I think we're not going to get rid of them until about 2024, I believe. That's when they're actually banned. And there are costs attached to having them.
So how big is this problem then, really, Joe?
I mean, it's a far larger problem than actually I expected it to be. A report by the Environmental Investigation Agency found that the illegal HFCs make up about 20 to 30% of the entire European market. Illicit HFCs make up 60% of all the gas used in Italy, 50 to 80% in Greece, Bulgaria and Romania. And this isn't actually that unusual. The fraudulent trade in legal products, essentially products that dodge tax and customs duties and other levies like that, is Europe's most lucrative criminal activity. It's estimated to generate around 77 billion euros a year, compared with about 30 billion euros for illicit drugs. So actually this is just a sort of a modern version, I guess, of an age-old problem of smuggling of legal goods, as opposed to taking what is arguably a bigger risk, like smuggling things like arms or drugs, as I mentioned.
I mean, there's actually a guy down the market near me, Holden, who sells old light bulbs and is fairly open about that and says, you can't buy these anymore, not since the EU banned them, but you can get them from me for 50p. And there's obviously people who want to keep their lamps running with old light bulbs at home. And I therefore wonder whether that sort of thing is baked in. Whenever a change is made at a global political level, people know that for perhaps 10 or 20 years afterwards, there'll be the equivalent of the guy down the car boot sale.
Yeah, I think that's true, and that the light bulb example in particular, I think that was a much bigger illicit market in the years immediately after those old filament bulbs were banned, because at that point the alternatives were those really unpleasant compact fluorescent bulbs, which took ages to warm up and had that kind of deathly, weird, depressing light. And so people really did want the old-fashioned technology. Once LED bulbs came along, which are in many ways better than the original, and as the price came down, that market has gone into the really small niches. And I think that's the sort of key to how you get over these problems, is you have to have alternatives which do the job better and at a price which matches what they're trying to replace, and trying to close loopholes like international differences in regulations which allow those price differentials to arise.
I presume there's some good news on that, though, Alok. I mean, refrigerants or whatever these products are going into presumably are getting cheaper and more widespread, the sort of environmentally friendly alternatives.
It's really hard to make refrigerants to replace HCFCs rather, because you're kind of still making some sort of organic compound that will have an environmental impact. Let's be clear that just because the new refrigerants, I think the newest one is called R32. That's the newest one. It's another organic compound. It's just related to HFCs and CFCs. It's just an iteration, and they're slightly less. There's less greenhouse gas warming potential and stuff. And I think that as chemistry of it improves, that you're going to get new versions of it. So yes, they are environmentally friendly, but ultimately they will have an impact. We're not going to get rid of it completely. What you need is completely different physics to make refrigerators, and that does exist. Albert Einstein had an idea for a fridge 100 years ago that doesn't require any sort of refrigerants whatsoever, which I could go into now, but it's quite complicated. But people are trying to build that.
What's the big obstacle to them building it, without going into the detail of what it is?
Oh God, this is really complicated.
Is it cost? Is it expediency? Why isn't it happening?
No, it's just it's like why can't we get rid of fossil fuels in the industry and have lots of wind turbines? There's an industry and there's lobby groups and there's supply lines and all of that. Whereas no one's building Einstein's fridge at the moment to sell it to you cheaply. It's still an R&D product 100 years later. Seriously, Google Einstein's fridge. It's actually a real thing, and you will thank me.
Okay. We were talking actually on our sister podcast Investments Unwrapped this week, Joe, about whether, we're talking about classic cars as an investment, and whether old-fashioned petrol becomes a black market for this reason as well. We know that's going to be phased out, but people are always going to want classic cars. So what are they going to fill them with? Do you think these things are thought through properly?
I mean, I think that an old-fashioned fridge is a somewhat less luxurious purchase than a classic car, so I don't think that it's going to be
a bit less cool than a Cadillac.
I suppose a Smeg or something other designer like that. I think what this does quite interestingly highlight is just how these black markets emerge and how, I think to an extent they are baked in with the smaller examples like people selling, non-environmentally friendly light bulbs in pub car parks, I think probably is baked into the system. I was reminded actually reading about this of a story that I remember from about 10 years ago when about 1 million pollution permits were stolen from a Czech carbon bank. And essentially hackers had hacked into this carbon bank and were distributing these permits that allow companies to pollute the atmosphere far more than they're allowed to under European regulations. And it did just make me think that these things are sort of an inevitable consequence of trying to clamp down and regulate anything, right? You could use prohibition going back further as an example of how black markets emerge when you try to regulate, not in that particular instance, such harmful products, but, harmful products. HFC smuggling is just, I think, probably one of the many obstacles to halting climate change. I think, illegal burning of waste and unregulated use of climate-harming chemicals and all of these things are also massive issues that we probably will just have to confront, and regulatory bodies will have to set up, agencies that have the capability to properly track this stuff down. But, I do think that it's just an inevitable consequence of trying to make what are obviously quite positive environmental policies.
Well, prohibition's an interesting example, isn't it, Holden? Because you've got some pretty nefarious characters associated with that trade, which is one of the reasons ultimately why it was decriminalised again. Is this, it seems tame. We're kind of laughing about it when we played the clip. It seems like a pretty prosaic black market. But is it going to attract, basically gangsters, criminal gangs? They're making money out of this. Where does that money go?
Yes, and then usually when you have a lucrative criminal market, there's then competition between different criminal gangs for control of it, and so it can have serious consequences in terms of violence. I think the broader issue, though, or perhaps the more consequential one, is the fact that it can undermine confidence in environmental legislation. If people see leaky borders and think that, well, we're trying to tackle the problem over here, and then over there it's continuing unabated, and I think that this is a relatively niche product that's unlikely to have much direct impact on most people. But we are now committed in the UK and in Europe to outlawing or restricting much further a lot of other things over the next couple of decades, like petrol, as you mentioned, but diesel, fuel oil, gas boilers, all of these things are on a kind of path to obsolescence. But they're not going to all disappear at the same time. There are still going to be people who will want to find ways. And so I think governments around the world are going to have to take into account this sort of demand for products that are no longer allowed, and how you maintain confidence in the sense of fairness around these bans, and give people a reason to think that it will be enforced in a judicious way.
And you have this argument around electric cars, don't you, Alok? You have it around wood burners. People saying, yeah, I get that they're not... the thing I'm using is old-fashioned and not environmentally friendly, but they want a simple equation, don't they? They say, is it really true? Is it really true because it doesn't feel true that if I get rid of this thing that I'm using, which isn't environmentally friendly, and replace it with a brand new thing that's had to be manufactured and flown from around the world, it's got a global supply chain, and still contains, as you were saying, harmful things for the environment, is that really better? It just doesn't feel like it possibly could be.
Well, that's just another example, I'm afraid, of human intuition not telling you how the real world works. And this is true of infinite number of things. Your personal view and experience of something is valuable, of course, and it should be always taken into account and thought about and everything. But when we think about populations and the whole world taking action on certain things, this is what it filters down to, is that individuals have to, in some way, take action. And the best way of taking action is not to have to decide by yourself which refrigerant to use or which fuel to use. It's the regulations do that for you so that you can just get on with your life. Most of us don't care what petrol we're using as long as it makes our car function and we've got a relatively new car. If you've got a classic car and you need old petrol for it, you're probably much more interested in that stuff, and you can probably deal with the regulations and think about it properly. That's me as a law-abiding citizen, right? I'm not thinking about getting things illegally. But personal intuition doesn't always translate to global international action, but that's no one's fault for not realising that.
Well, it is your duty in the law, Alok, to bring us our third story, and that's coming up after this. Okay, Alok, you're finishing the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Another new hope for the other pandemic.
There are a group of people that are known as elite controllers, especially with HIV infection in particular, who have a natural ability to basically suppress the level of viral activity, in this case, HIV. Again, incredibly rare, but something that offers hope for potential future treatments.
Primary care physician Dr. Kavita Patel speaking to NBC News. Alok, what's she talking about?
So this is the second instance of a person, the second only documented person whose body seems to have eliminated HIV completely on its own. There's a possibility that this person's immune system might have just provided what's called a sterilizing cure, which is eliminating the virus itself. Now, just think back, HIV is the big bogeyman. I mean, until COVID came along, it's the pandemic that everyone is concerned about. And it's still there. It's still there in the background. It's been with us for 40 years or more. No cures, no vaccines, yes, lots of drugs, but it's kind of just evaded all attempts to tackle it. And so whenever you get a situation where people have managed to clear the virus from them, I mean, they're studied like nobody's business, and we want to understand why.
But this isn't thanks, it seems, to any particular medical intervention. That, it appears her body has rid itself of HIV.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is a study published in the Annals of Internal Medicine a few days ago. And what it seems, no one really knows why this has happened. They've just tested this Argentinian woman over many, many, many years. She's even been pregnant and given birth to an HIV-free child. So, they've just studied her and they cannot find any traces of virus. A few fragments of the DNA of the virus, but nothing else.
Right, so they know she had it.
Oh yeah, definitely. They know she was infected. Her partner, who died many years ago, also had it. There's theories around why it could have happened. It could be that she has very strong T cells. T cells are a part of the immune system in the body, and maybe that happened. And you heard there in the clip about elite controllers. Elite controllers is the term for around 1% of people who have HIV are elite controllers, which means that their bodies just seem to just not show any impact from it whatsoever. They might have it in their system, but they don't actually show any impact with it. And understanding how they do it, and we can start to do that with modern molecular biology and genetics. Understanding how they do it is really the path towards finding a proper cure.
Yeah, because it's only through that understanding, Joe, that anything truly positive for the world can come out of this, bearing in mind it's so rare. And that's the thing that's hard to get your head around, isn't it? It seems like a hopeful story, but it's the second documented person ever. So if we all wait for that to naturally kick in, you're going to have a lot of dead people. No,
absolutely. But I don't think we should underplay how exciting a discovery this is. This woman joins a lady called Lauren Williamberg, who is from Northern California, who was the first person, as you say, to have been cured without either bone marrow transplant or medication.
Well, the first person we know of, right? I mean, this may have happened, presumably did, without anyone noticing.
Well, quite, yeah. The first person that we know of and that we've been able to research, which, as Alok says, is the kind of key to unlocking here a potentially life-changing discovery for the millions of people that live all around the world with HIV. The researcher that worked on the Willenberg research has suggested, as Alok said, that she may have had unusually powerful T cells, which is possibly something that she shares with this Argentine woman who's been known as the Esperanza patient, which obviously translates to hope patient. But yeah, understanding this mechanism and what it is that has produced this sort of sterilising cure that these two women seem to have been able to produce could be key to developing therapeutic vaccines. It could clear out HIV without long-term consequences. So while we shouldn't get too far ahead of ourselves, because obviously this is going to be an incredibly labour and time and cost-intensive research project, it's nonetheless incredibly exciting, I think.
I wonder, Holden, whether... I don't want to pour cold water on this because obviously it is exciting, as Joe says, but I do wonder if there's almost a danger in reporting this, in the sense that you could just imagine some people maybe not reporting their own symptoms as soon as they should, if they think it's possible that they might cure themselves. You can imagine some people of faith saying, oh, well, maybe if you just pray for it to go away, it can go away. Well, it actually might not be helpful in the short term for people to think this is an option.
There's always been a bit of a debate around HIV in particular, and the huge advances that have been made in therapeutic treatments over the past sort of 10, 15 years, and the worry that if you make it seem less of a threat, then people will take fewer precautions to protect themselves. That doesn't really seem to be borne out by the results in the widespread use of both the antiviral drugs and the pre-exposure prophylaxis that prevents people from contracting the virus if exposed. Those are incredibly effective, and the ability to treat the disease has led to a huge reduction in its spread in the areas where those are available. The areas where it's still spreading faster, that tends to be the poorer countries where those drugs are not available. So I think I think in part because HIV is so closely associated with sexual morality, homophobia, religious practices around sex, there's often a slight muddying of the waters around clinical advice and moral or religious advice. And so I completely agree with your premise that there will be reluctance to talk about this for those reasons, but I think that reluctance is misplaced.
And you said, Alok, that there's a lot of speculation as to why this woman appears to have sort of cleansed herself of HIV. So I'm not going to ask you to speculate because it is speculation, but of the speculation you've seen, what seems the most promising in your view?
So, I mean, if you allow me to get a little bit nerdy here, that it's really interesting to try and unpack what's going on, because obviously the Esperanza patient is the second, but there's been one before, and also people have found that other people have created what's called functional cures, where if they've been on pills for a long time, they also seem to have controlled the virus hugely. Now, to understand why this has happened, you kind of need to understand why HIV is so difficult to actually treat. I mean, what it does is that it affects your immune system cells itself, and it hides within the genes of those cells. So the genes of the cells are the ones that get reproduced all the time. So accidentally, your body just produces lots of copies of the HIV virus. And so that's why it's so clever. And, it means that it's very hard to get rid of. So with these elite controllers, one idea is that the immune system cells in those people have managed to sort of corner the HIV genes into a part of their genome which doesn't get reproduced very much, and it just sort of stops it from reproducing. And so it's still there in your genes, but basically it can't reproduce, and your body's done that. And they've shown that some people who've been on antivirals for a very long time also approach this sort of cure. So if you can somehow find a technique to do that in people who have HIV, that's a functional cure, basically. And another thing is if they can study the T cells of this lady, what you'll get is something called correlates of protection. When you have a vaccine, what you look for in a patient afterwards is something called the correlate of protection. It's like, what is the molecule that's been created inside your body that's protecting you? And so if you can use this T cell, the special T cell that the woman has as a correlate of protection, you can then start to look for it when you do lab studies of future vaccines, so that you get a much clearer idea of which vaccines are likely to work. And so that's very, very, very exciting.
And I mean, I realise we have a sample size of 2, but is there anything in the fact that they're both female, do you think?
Yeah, I did wonder this myself, and this is very unscientific. I mean, could it be? I don't know. No, probably not. but it is an intriguing thing that makes you sort of raise your eyebrow a little bit, doesn't it?
Also, again, whilst we're being very unscientific, some people were saying maybe it's because her partner died of HIV, somehow she may have been exposed to it and built up immunity. I don't even know if that's the right vocabulary for what we're discussing, but
that's the right vocabulary, and that's a possibility too. I mean, it's a bit like your body's immune system is constantly battered by all sorts of things, and you don't often get ill, but it's still learning how to deal with things. And there are things called cross reactions, where a virus you're infected with produces antibodies inside you, which then protect you against a different virus that's sort of similar. So, for example, a lot of people who've had colds before, caused by coronaviruses, different ones, were protected against the novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19. And so there's some protection there. This happens all the time. It happens with cold viruses, happens with flu viruses. Why not with HIV? I mean, HIV is just a bizarre and complicated virus. So no one has hoped for this sort of stuff, but it sounds like maybe you can prepare the body in some way. I don't know how you'd reproduce that, though. You wouldn't want to infect people with HIV on purpose.
But it is weird, and we made this point on the show before in the last 2 years, Joe, because evidently of what's been happening in the news. But it does highlight that we're so many decades into this, when with other pandemics and other diseases, perhaps it's money, perhaps it's who's affected. things seem to be moving a lot more quickly.
Yes, and even the vocabulary that we're using to talk about this, things like T cells are suddenly on the front page of newspapers on a regular basis, which they certainly weren't 2 years ago. I think there possibly is, who is affected and a money element to this. I think there's also the fact that HIV, while there's no known cure, is becoming increasingly controllable, perhaps. There are lots of drugs available on the market now. There's a recently approved jab that you can take. And you can also, there is examples of people that have been cured when they've received stem cell transplants. So that is a dangerous and complicated way of treating something that can be controlled with daily pill regimes and injections. But the reality of this is that, millions of people are still infected with HIV, according to the World Health Organization. They estimate that about 500,000 to 1 million people died from HIV-related causes last year, and between 1 and 2 million people acquired HIV. So if this does open up a new door to research that could make controlling these things, or even, as Alok quite rightly says, eliminating these things in people that are already infected, more possible, then that's fantastic. And I think this is a really exciting potential area of research.
A positive thought to end on. Thank you. My thanks to Joe and Holden and Alok for presenting their findings. Only the best research is ever published in this podcast. We're in the final edit anyway. Remember, you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. If you found us today via a Spotify playlist, by the way, hello. Do now tap go to podcast, then tap follow, and you'll get us every week. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.